Good morning, good evening, greetings, salutations, welcome, all of the above to the Safe Room featuring Security Side Quest. My name is Tristan Watty, and thank you for joining me with Russ, the mysterious Marvel himself. See, I'm trying to do it backwards like Yoda, but it's not quite working out. But I'll go with it. I hope everybody's doing well and a happy Monday out there to you. And
Happy
hi
Monday
there
to
to
you.
you too, the Tech Bee. Right? So, if this is your first time joining, let me say producer Jeff is awesome. So say hi to producer Jeff in chat, as well as reintroduce ourselves the proper way. So I am Tristan Watty. I come to you from the professional services division of AWS, where we help to accelerate customers' journey to the cloud in a secure manner, fashion, form, and way. And Russ, where do you join from?
I'm joining from the Security Incident Response Team, where we help contain and mitigate your, cybersecurity bad days.
Yes. And if you want to have a good day with us, feel free to put it in chat and let us know where you're dialing in from, where you're tuning in from, or where you're just viewing. I like to say it a couple times, 3 times for the people on the other side of the internet. But if that question is something that you would like to take the dramatic pause and think about, we have another one kind of queued up for you. And it's a little bit of a light read. So, Russ, let me take the deep breath. Would you rather speak every language fluently but never play a musical instrument, or master every musical instrument ever created but only speak one language for the rest of your life? Go.
I enjoy listening to music more than making music. So I'm going to go with the languages so that way I can speak to more and different people. But I do have an extreme bias because I did go to school and learn another language. So yeah, I'm big on the learning another language and being able to learn. You don't just learn the language, you learn the culture too. So long answer, but I'm gonna go with the languages.
Yes.
Final answer.
Languages. It's funny because I would agree with you. I would go with languages too. I would rather speak every language fluently because I went a couple of years without playing a musical instrument. I think I could go a couple more without and be able to speak all the languages without going through, 10 years of learning all the nuances.
It would have been helpful to have that before.
Yeah. And take it for a person who's currently learning Spanish and Japanese. I would rather have this up, down, left, right code right now. So thank you. And as always, so the Tech Bee, is there documentation about this event and all other AWS events? So if you are joining from the Twitch live stream, you'll be able to see the Twitch calendar with all the upcoming live streams. And feel free to come back every Monday at 2 p.m. Eastern or 11 a.m. Pacific Standard Time. See, us East Coast, I have to translate in my head. But the one thing you don't have to translate is a nice clap and wave. And thank you, Dragono, as always, for joining in. And, well, from Texas, hi. Thanks for joining in. Ari, as always. And Tech, you come from San Francisco Bay Area. Thank you. Just found an hour ago. Thank you for stumbling in. On this show, we like to go off the rails as we're speaking about security topics because we like to dive into the nuances. And we also like to say, ooh, shiny, and go after that. So thank you for joining in. And we have a couple more. Dragon's coming from US East 2. Nice. I'm coming from US East 1. So I can't tune a paper bag. That is funny. And the last comment right now is Spanish is more difficult than English, but easier than learning to play guitar. Yes, I tried to play guitar and it was always interesting, right? And one of the things I tried to play with Rocksmith. That was my whole experience trying to play a guitar, which really it worked out, but it didn't for me because I wasn't good at it. So
I was gonna say air guitar.
Air guitar counts, right?
I believe there was some air guitar competitions on the sports networks this weekend. So
yeah, it's funny because I couldn't even find the air if I tried. But the one thing I could find is today's topic. And what is today's topic? Well, spoilers are in the title, but Russ, where did we come from last week that we're coming to you from this week?
Yes. So last week was our Rest at the Bonfire, all progress saved with AWS backup. You don't need to have watched last week's episode to follow along with this week's episode, which is The Circle is Closing, Enhancing Your AWS Data Perimeter. That should be the good one.
Yeah. Spoilers. It probably will be a great one. You know why? Because everybody who's listening, as well as tuning in, Deadlock from Beacon, New York. Thank you for joining in. And Velvet plays guitar, flute, and it's funny. Cheers to you for playing all of those instruments. But I think the place that we want to start with today is trying to understand the topic, right? We have enhancing your AWS data perimeter. We touched upon some key aspects over the weeks, right? Some SCPs and permission boundaries. But if you have some of the basics, some of the fundamentals in place, where do you go to next? And this is where this concept of closing the circle comes into place, right? And you may say, wait, what is closing the circle? Well, if you played any sort of video game that had a circle that kind of closed in over time, you may think of one, 10 billion points to you if you thought of one. The concept is, as you get closer to the center, right? Anything outside is excluded, and there's no ands, ifs, or buts to it, right? It's you're outside the circle. You do not have access, one, to come into the circle, and two, you're excluded and dropped, right? In a variety of fashions, depending on what game you're playing. And that's where we wanted to go with today's topic is understanding, okay, if you are building your towers of defense, maybe you're 3 towers, right? I was going to say 2 towers, but that was too on the nose. Because when you're building your perimeter fortress, Russ, I'll be here all week, I'm telling you.
I know.
If you're building out your defense and your perimeter fortress, how do you do this? Where does it come from? Where does it go? Russ finished that in his head. But forging the ultimate loadout, right? And that's where you go to next. When you think of, okay, I have to build this perimeter fortress around my AWS environment, my organization, and I want to build, let's say, a loadout so you can rinse and repeat. Because that's one of the key concepts that we start to think about, right? Is you don't want to do everything manually. Because if you played, analogies, any type of video game where you had to put together something really fast and something is coming at you, you don't want to say select from menu, select from menu, select from menu, select from menu, select. You just want to say auto done, right? So that's where you want to go is how do you have some policy orchestration within your environment, your fortress, your kingdom, depending on what game you're playing, so that if there's unexpected drops or unexpected, let's say, players that are trying to enter into your circle, you have the capabilities to, let's say, expel said intruders. The other piece of that is getting to a place where individuals inside don't, pass sensitive information or the crown jewels, if you're playing a certain type of game, outside. That's where you want to get to, right? So the exfiltration portion of it is a big piece of this. So as Velvet go through all the terminology, and thank you, we like to come up with analogies here that somewhat make sense.
And really just tickle our own nerd fantasy.
Yeah, to see how much we can stretch our knowledge of the popular variety, right?
Yep. Has nothing to do with seeing me break and laugh at all.
Yeah, no, not at all. Because you know what's not scary? Data exfiltration. Or is it? See, I got you. So when you think of data exfiltration, this is a scenario that often plays out when you're going through a tabletop exercise, you're going through an audit, you're going through, hey, should I set up the policy like this? This is the key thing. So when you think of data exfiltration, what are you thinking of? Are you thinking of somebody copying your S3 objects to a bucket outside your organization? Overly permissive cross-account roles getting exploited? Data leakage? Or maybe a compromised identity accessing resources they should have never touched? Russ, in your experience what has been some of the key aspects of this?
So there's definitely, I mean, a bunch of key aspects to protecting that against that sort of thing. But the big thing that I see, especially with incident responses, once that data is out there or exposed, that's it, it's exposed. And so, some of the things that, some of the policies or implementations that, are put in, once you're at that point, I look at data exfiltration and ransomware kind of as the same thing, where it's like, once it happens, like there's not much else we can do. Those are the things that's why, like you said, they're in every single, exercise or, any sort of scenario-based training or whatever. It's always going to be ransomware and data exfiltration because that has the most impact. And once it happens, there's no pulling it back. There's no expelling that outside of your circle, And so yeah, that's kind of what I take out of those situations is, we have to do everything we can because, there's not a lot of incident response. I mean, obviously we'll contain and mitigate, prevent it from happening in the future. But once that data's gone and they have access to it, there's really no getting that back. So that's why the preventative controls are just so important because there's just no letting, that cat back into the bag at that point. So
yeah,
that's why, that's what I take out of that for sure.
And I was thinking of a bag of cats, right? That's usually the analogy of trying to herd a bag of cats or whatever it is. And I think Velvet brings up a good piece to kind of go off on a side tangent on, right? So we want to stop it before it happens. Once it happens, it's too late. And this is an interesting thing because the analogy I come up with and think about is when you are playing any of these games, if we stay on topic, right, where you have to defend your fortress or your castle or something along those lines. The place you don't want to be in is, oh, there's something happening to this wing or this piece of the castle, and I have to go try and build some. Oh, I'm out of energy, right? And that energy is usually, if we're sticking with the analogy, your resources, right? These are your individuals that have to look into what's going on because you want to have proactive defenses in place that are automated, that are taking care of it. They're strong perimeter pieces, right, of the data variety. And where you go with that is, how do I do this before it happens? Because once you're in the midst of it, what ends up happening is usually something gets sacrificed, for lack of better words, right? If you're playing those type of games, it's like, oh, I can only take care of this or this. You want some mechanisms in place so it doesn't even get to that point. Because you can deal with it, but if you have a data exfiltration scenario, right, how much data got exfiltrated while you were trying to contain, to Russ's point? So it's a great question. And that's kind of where you want to understand, right? Because if we go for a circle analogy, as it starts to tighten, the playable area gets smaller and more controlled. So if you think about what your circled area is, it's our defense in depth, right? Where you think of your identity perimeter, your resource perimeter, your network perimeter, they're acting like those closing zones, right? That keep the unauthorized access out and force all the activity into a trusted state, right? A monitored space. This is kind of where you want to go, right? So if you're looking at these different perimeters or these different circles, one, your brain goes to, certain animes that have 3 circles around it. Tabulating points to you if you could point out which one. But starting with the outside, that's your identity perimeter, right? Ensuring only recognize players from your game or your organization are allowed into that location, right? Using certain condition keys. And what are those condition keys? That's your principal org ID, your principal AWS service. Those are the ones that separate your friends and your foes, right? So those are the pieces that you want to understand, right? And, well, and the resources, the perimeter defense to speak, those are automated security mechanisms. Yeah, so these are your automated security controls. If you think about some of the pieces that we spoke about, like service control policies, right? These are automated mechanisms that you already deployed within your environment that say, deny this action. And having something like a principal org ID condition key keeps things inside your org, right? It keeps your friends and your foes separate. I keep using that terminology because it's a little bit easy to understand, right? Because you want to say the bad person, but it may not be a bad person. It may be someone in your organization that just doesn't know any better, for lack of better words, right? Is, hey, we're doing this integration with this partner or this resource or this company, and we have this area we have to share out information. Oh, we'll just do this. Okay, yeah, that would work. That's the fastest way to do this. But by doing so, they could enhance the risk to your organization. Russ, I don't know if you've seen or heard of those type of scenarios before, where it's just like, oh, we were just trying to share out something with somebody, but then it left the floodgates open almost.
Absolutely. And that is and that's just in general, right? Something that we have to be concerned about. And so I like to, to keep the video game analogy going on, there's certain, let's call them strategies, strats, whatever, that certain people will take. In this case, we can use things like ransomware or data exfiltration as our strats, right? So we already know what, they're going to do as the circle gets tighter and tighter. Maybe they're going to camp in a building where the middle of the circle is, or, maybe they'll use the circle to kind of pop in and pop out or something like that, right? You already know that these strategies are going to be used. So you come up with countermeasures. So whether that's, throwing grenades into a building before you clear it or something like that, you have something prepared to be able to handle that. And that's kind of what we're talking about in general, as security, excuse me, is using those countermeasures to prevent those strategies from working. So in this case, we're using our data perimeter. So, what kind of countermeasures, are available to us? Like Tristan was saying, we have our service control policies, we have our resource control policies, we have different IAM policies. But if I go back to the analogy of the video games, your service control policies are kind of like your primary weapons. Your go-to for, your first call, basically, for when something's going to happen. That's the countermeasure that you kind of want to use most often. It's like the default. And then your resource control policies are when you need maybe a more specific, type of, let's call them like special attack, or, maybe your special weapon, if you will. You're like, hey, it's coming down. There's not a lot of room. The circle's tightening. Maybe I don't want my whatever, fast firing primary weapon is. Maybe I need that shotgun because I need a very specific tool for a specific job. In this case, I'm trying to go get into resource control policies, because that's at the resource level, enforcing those controls directly to the resources. So it's a little bit more specialized to the problem at hand. So I kind of put it towards that. And then we have things that are more like armor or shield or whatever game you're playing. So having like body armor, like your VPC endpoint policies, which is, your armor at the network layer, which is analyzing incoming traffic, ensuring, only approved entities or, approved, whatever signatures you're using, IP addresses, domains, whatever, network signatures, just making sure that who is supposed to come into your account or environment is actually authorized to do so. So there's a bunch more. There's like S3 bucket policies. S3 generally use that as like the vault, because, that's usually where data is going to be stored, especially critical data. So kind of using that as like our vault to protect our winnings or whichever game, depending on what you're doing, either your loot or your winnings or whatever. S3 bucket policies are preventing, other teams coming in and stealing all of your good stuff. And so just trying to add those different layers, like Tristan mentioned before, it's defense in depth. So adding all of these together, is your loadout all together. So you have, your primary weapons, your SCPs, you got your special attacks, your RCPs, body armor and our loot vault and all of these things. That's your whole loadout. That's what's going to help you win. It's instead of just having, I have one really good, SCP and I just use that for everything. You're not going to win that way. You need to adapt. So there's a lot of, of that defense in depth going into that, building on top of each other. So now you have a service control policy, that is backed up by a resource control policy, which is connected to a VPC that has endpoint policies that only allow certain network identities or whatever. And then you have bucket policies. So even if they do get access through everything, they still can't access your most secure loot vault, if you will, your critical information, your critical data. So once you stack all of these together, you're like, wow, okay, here's an actual defense strategy. Here's, all of the equipment that I can use in this environment to, obviously close the circle and win the game. So it's kind of like, the same way we use the castle analogy a lot, where you have your moat and your gate guards and your crown jewels and your vault and stuff. It's the same concept, but we're just looking at it as more from the perimeter side of your organization or your infrastructure, instead of taking it from a different aspect. So we really use a lot of the same principles with defense in depth, just at different points in our organizations. So especially perimeter security being extremely important, because that's who has access to your, infrastructure. That's the type of thing, you want to be extremely cognizant of when, you're not only setting up a new organization, but also trying to, let's say, improve or mature some of your existing security policies to be maybe more automated or more responsive in that sort of, fast-paced environment, whatever it is. But yeah, using that sort of video game analogy or the castle analogy, it's really the same thing. It's just using those different equipment, in this case, our resources, AWS resources, to be able to win the game, protect your castle, whatever your goal or objective is. So yeah, I think that's kind of how I look at policy orchestration versus our video game loadout analogy.
Yeah, I would say to add to Velvet's item as well, right? When you think of approved roles, kind of the methodology you think about when you're looking at the defense in depth, if you have something like a landing zone, right? And within your landing zone, you have the different layers that you can add to that landing zone. What I mean by that is you have the control tower layer, and then you have the enhancements of a landing zone where you can have service control policies and permission boundaries. And what usually happens is, hey, if you have this setup, who is able to make modifications to it? That's a big part of the puzzle in the equation is, all right, approved roles. Which roles are the approved roles? If you have a control tower set up, now you have an execution role where a control tower is the only thing that can provision these resources into your environment, right? That's a big part of the puzzle, because once you figure out these little nuances, you can first say hello, but two, you can start to refine your different layers of your defense in depth to the point that, hey, if you're stacking all these together, you can look at it holistically throughout your environment. We speak about the target state security strategy, but we also speak about knowing your environment. And that's a key piece when it comes to the governance aspect of things, right? Oftentimes we have customer conversations and we're speaking about, oh, what does this do? Well, this team developed it and they put it into place, and I don't really know what these 5 servers do. Okay, one of those services compromised. Okay, who's the owner? Oh, that owner left the organization 5 years ago, or something along those lines, and is just running. Those are the kind of things that you don't want to happen. And we're speaking about being proactive. This is part of those proactive items, is taking a survey of your castle, understanding where all the exits are, where the entrances are. Do you have guards at every post? Do you have the correct mechanisms in place to respond to whatever's happening? And the best way to learn about these things is to learn from experience. And that's where we get into, as SideQuest legend has it, right? Because what's a legend? Well, stick around and listen to the calm, soothing sounds and I would say melody for our original music item. And you may say, hey, what is this section? Well, this section is where we bring a customer story into reality. And how do we bring in that reality? Well, with our trusty SideQuest board, which is a visual representation of our customer story. So, if we were to dive into our side quests, let's think of a customer. Let's call them Dropstorm Studios. That sounds great. And let's say they're out of Austin, Texas. Right? Sounds feasible. So they thought, as their company, they locked down their perimeter. They migrated their gaming platform to the AWS cloud, and they have the infrastructure, real-time telemetry. They have pipelines. They have anti-cheat analytics. So they felt everything's good, but their studio started to expand out more and more, and they decided, hey, we have managed services. Let's grab managed services. And I take that dramatic pause for AMS, AWS Managed Services, right? Because it's 24/7 operational. But they did this because they had a reason. They had a growing player base. They had a realization that they had their crown jewels that they had to protect within their S3 bucket, within their AWS environment. And the one thing that they have is authenticated and unauthenticated users looking at their platform, participating in their platform. So they thought they had the correct SCPs in place. Well, we take that pause to say, maybe they did, maybe they didn't. Well,
did you though?
And that is the question that we go with the announcer voice, because they believe they have that sealed data perimeter and they don't allow hacking or cheating within their environment, but they suddenly get a message saying, hey, there's something going on some of the servers. And within 2 hours, the security team is working to figure it out. So that's where our side quest begins. This is where our legend begins, with a simple set environment. And with that environment, they're trying to figure it out. So how do they do this? Well, let's jump right in to our side quest. So if we figure out, hey, how do we tell friend from foe? They're all so close to each other, right? That's an interesting conversational piece. But as we learned about, often the difference between having direct access is kind of taking a step back and understanding what layers do we have in place, understanding what we have audited, what is in our environment. And Russ, the question I pose to you as we go on this quest of understanding is, hey, when does a customer usually realize they have gaps within their data perimeter?
After they find it on the open internet. Unfortunately.
Yes. And that is the piece that they usually go through, because how do they do this? Well, they may have something in their S3 buckets within, hey, we have S3 buckets and maybe we have a drive storage and we copied and pasted some files, and all of a sudden the auditor is asking, how do you handle this data? Well, the key thing somebody may say is, hey, we have a WAF in place. This is known to be useful. But it goes back into the question of, do you know your environment? Are all the rules covered within your environment? Can you think of different ways to understand, hey, we have SCPs, we have a WAF. What other mechanisms do we need within our environment, Russ?
Well, an SCP really only, I mean, that's your primary weapon, but it's also like, what kind of SCPs, you know, were you giving access to your developers or engineers or whatever, or were you just giving them access, or were you demonstrating what they should have access to? Instead of, you know, saying, hey, this SCP allows this engineer to do S3, it's like, okay, well, what in S3, you know? Do we really want everything in S3, even our critical buckets? I mean, should anyone have access to that?
And that's where we have identity face up in understanding mode, right? Where we have to understand what are our identity sources, right? And what we start to see is the picture unfolds a little bit more. And the road from authenticated user and authenticated user, or unauthenticated user, it starts to break apart a little bit, right? Because, hey, you're unauthenticated. What mechanism were we saying, hey, this person is able to access our environment? And if they continue to try and access our environment, there are different alerts that are being picked up. Hey, there's suspicious activity. There's suspicious behavior, right? And this is where we have something like guard duty in the environment, and we have CloudTrail logs and things of that nature. But the main piece that we're trying to get to is, this is our sensitive information, and maybe we have it set up in such a way that we have mechanisms proactively monitoring our environment, monitoring to say, hey, if something happens within the environment, since this is a gaming company, it has some scale, we want to have layers, identity and resource and all of the above. And the ways to do this is few and far between of step functions. I keep going back to step functions for a reason, because
they're awesome.
They are a great tool, right? When you're thinking of, hey, how do I automate my environment? How do I, develop this point, be proactive about things? And this is where you start to have to understand how everything plays into your equation. And you may say, hey, this looks a little bit like it's still all over the place. And I would say and agree with you, like, hey, yeah, it is, because pieces are missing. And those pieces, we have to hit the pause game button for, right? Because there's something that you need to take a realization to, that you need to flip-flop and figure out why things occur a certain way. One, to avoid this type of game over music from playing, right? Because what you're trying to get to is that lovely applause when everything goes right and everything is automated, right? And the way to do so is, first, just saying hello, right? And two, saying thank you for loving the music. But three is understanding the different use cases there are for your environment. What I mean by that is, we mentioned a bunch of different services, and what we need to expound upon is, if you have service principles like CloudTrail and config, AWS backup, okay, these are able to move in your perimeter, right? Because they're inside your circle. But you need to know how to say, hey, how do we do so without somebody, let's say, taking advantage of it? How do we do it without saying, hey, these API calls are not what I expected? How do I do this without saying, hey, your data's not in another castle? It's here, and I want to protect it, right? These are all pieces of the puzzle that you want to put together in such a way that you understand, okay, calls are coming Yeah, Macy, right? It just popped into my head. CloudTrail.amazon.aws.com. Understanding what a service principal is an important part of the equation, right? Because if you're trying to get to the nuance of, let's say, preventing something like a confused deputy attack or understanding how the services work, you want to understand the fundamentals of each service and what their principles look like. And then looking at, hey, your identities, and then looking at the overall picture. The one thing you don't want to do is stop your organization from functioning by just blocking everything, right? That'd be great. Just deny everything. It was good. No,
Secure.
It's secure. Nobody can work. What you want to do is balance out, hey, starting off, do you know your organization to what services you're going to leverage within your environment? What I mean by that is, if AWS has 200 plus services, are you using all 200 at this given point in time, or are you using 50? If you know you're using 50 because you're just starting out, you could deny the other 150 plus services and just say, SCP, deny these services from being used, right? There's logic that you can put, is not if and all these things, but the general concept is now you reduced the things that you have to think about. You reduce, okay, if I have 40 doors on my castle, do we really need 40 doors? Maybe we need 5, right? These are the questions you start to ask yourself, especially when you're thinking of your data perimeter controls. And the data perimeter controls, if you're thinking from an identity standpoint, we spoke about permission boundaries in the past. This is where it starts to come into, right? By defining the maximum permissions that IAM principal can receive from identity-based policies. This is how you start to close the circle in a little bit, right? From identity perspective. And as Russ mentioned, there's a resource perspective and so on and so forth. But essentially what you're doing is you're understanding the services and the identities and the boundaries that come with it. Because if you have, let's say, overly aggressive perimeter policies that can knock out your own administrators, the CI/CD pipelines, your critical automations, everything in between, this is the kind of stuff that, start to affect your environment, right? Because nobody can do anything. And this is kind of where the balance comes into play. So part of this equation is, first, understanding what the boundaries are, what your maximums are, and not locking yourself out of your environment. Russ, have you seen the other way where it's just like it's overly permissive, where things don't work, like logs, right? Or, it prevented the logs from, let's say, being generated because they're blocked?
Yes. Yes, there's everything you can think of. I've probably seen at this point. Yes, and it's honestly not uncommon, to have, say, a cloud trail pointing at a specific, say, log because you want S3 logs, and then you mess up which bucket those are going to, because there's a lot of bucket names sometimes, especially if you have, so many different buckets, things get a little complicated. I've definitely seen cases like that, cases where there was overly permissive and things weren't able to get accessed. So they assumed there was an incident because things weren't working, which can, be a little bit of a relief. You're like, well, thank God there's no actual incident. But then you go, dang, I just spent so much time investigating this incident when it's not. If we just didn't set up our permissions properly. Yeah, I've definitely seen it.
Yeah, and the quick thing as we're talking about buckets so much, account regional namespaces for Amazon S3 general purpose buckets. This is an interesting concept because it changes how you view bucket names, which can be really great if you have a target state security plan. The reason why I mention this is because naming conventions is always one of my things, right? If I were to take the step back and kind of think about this, right? My bucket and my bucket one, right? It it's that type of naming convention, right, that allows for some gaps. What I mean by that is if you don't have the governance policies laid out around certain things, it can be a little bit confusing, to Russ's point. And that's why I took that little side tangent, just to mention that one key critical piece. So,
Bucket underscore 8765443.
Yeah, right, and dash free, right? Of course, right?
Yeah, it's the third version that we didn't actually back up. Yeah, of course.
Yeah. So, when it comes to your perimeter, right? If we are thinking of the 3 rings of perimeter, Russ, which do you think is the hardest to close? The identity perimeter, because it's managing who's trusts, which gets complicated. Resource perimeter, because resources are everywhere and hard to track. Or network perimeter, because VPC and endpoints, they get complex. Which do you think?
Okay, so as much as I would like to say something, the evidence overwhelmingly shows that it is absolutely identity perimeter. So just pure numbers, it's absolutely going to be that one. But I think it's not the hardest to close. I think it's just the most commonly abused method. But I think that resource perimeter is extremely difficult to close because that's when you start getting into really nitty gritty. And you can go from overly permissive, everyone has permission to all of these services and everything you can do under each service, to this person only has permission to, this instance during these times in this geographical window. And then things happen because, we work around people. And so people need to access things regardless of where they are or what they're doing sometimes. And so once you get super specific, it can be almost a hindrance. And so I think that line, especially because there's so many different resources, in each service, there's how many different. So definitely that with the added complexity, especially if you're not doing something like, infrastructure as code. So I'm going to put that.
Yeah, that is a good answer because when you think about it, identity is who can access, and then resource is what can access. That's kind of how I always think of it, right? And the who can access, usually for the most part, people know who can access what. Do they configure it to reflect that? Not always. And that's why I think it's sometimes the most common use cases of things. But understanding what the resources are and how they function, and like you think of the differences between understanding S3 and understanding Lambda and the SQS and so on and so forth. A little bit harder to manage if you don't understand the service itself and kind of how it works. Because a lot of times under the hood, you might be used to, okay, this service works like this. But what you don't know is, it makes a Lambda call, right, in the background. And it does this. Or it initiates this way and it has to use CloudWatch or something along those lines, right? It's just understanding those little nuances, especially if you customize it a lot, can be challenging. So I would go with resource perimeter as well. And if anybody in the comments wants to drop down which one they think is, their most favorite or least favorite when it comes to closing the gap, identity, resource, network, feel free. Or say, hey, all 3 of them, because then to work together is interesting.
Yeah. And also maybe why you think it's but yeah, no, you bring up a lot of good points, especially about resources, because if thinking about it from not just the security aspect, but as a developer, it feels like it is a barrier, but it's really the different accesses to resources and stuff like that, especially once you start getting into, I need permissions for this because I'm building something or testing something or whatever. So there's a lot of that sort of permission requesting and stuff like that. And so that's not when you're being a barrier to production, you're being a barrier to insecure production. So it's not the same type of thing where you're being a blocker. You're saying, hey, this sort of, permissions and having this wildly open is how we get into, a lot of bigger messes and, come see me. And so, how do we, give people the permissions that they need without either going too far into overly permissive, but also not blocking them from being able to do things that they're supposed to be doing. If they're coding, securely by design, then there shouldn't be any blockers. But if they're, trying to reach out to different permissions and resources that they don't necessarily need to, that's when things start to get very complicated very quickly. And so that can be very tough, especially when you're trying to not be a blocker and be like, hey, yeah, here's, this production account access. So that way, you could test it out in production or some other, thing that, is not a good best practice. And so, taking that and then, trying to do that at scale is super tough, because then you have 100 developers and all of them want access to things. So yeah, that's just to layer on.
Yeah. And I think a key aspect of that as well is once you try to cater to all the developers, one of the questions that usually comes up is, has this person worked with AWS before? Do they kind of know the ins and outs? Do they do their, certifications and dive deeps and things of that nature, right? Because oftentimes what you see is, hey, we're migrating fast to AWS and we need to refactor or, rework our application in order for it to work with the migration. And they might just start using services and requesting permissions and doing all these things where in a normal, scenario, when you're in that run phase, you see something come through and it's an automatic kind of like bounce away, right? It's denied. I just keep using that, right? That's kind of how I picture it, right? And what we're trying to avoid is just saying yes to everything, right? Because when you start to get to that point of understanding the environment, your governance strategy, now it becomes easier to say, hey, this is not our organization's policy to do this. Here is our policy listed. Or thinking about, hey, when I get to a point of understanding my organization, it's usually based off of the documentation you create. What I mean by that is once you know a service, you write about the service. Now your developers can consume the service within your environment. And usually that's with service adoption documentation and things of that nature, right? So protecting your data, yes, that's a big part of it. And closing the circle, that's the other side. That's your defense in depth. And that's your strategy that you're getting to, right? Because what you're trying to avoid is the feeling of, your heart going faster and beating a little bit out of control, right? And that usually comes from the not knowing, the unknown. And the best way to know is to dive in and think about, hey, can I go on a quest of the knowledge variety? Can I take knowledge quests? And I know you're saying, hey, what is said knowledge quest? Well, it is our deep dive segment where we go into the different ways to help upscale and up level and do all those things in between when you're trying to figure out, hey, what am I doing in AWS? What am I doing within the environment? How do I handle this? These are the questions that new developers ask because they don't always know and they're trying to get more comfortable with moving forward, right? So the best way to do this is, hey, exactly right. All of it works together. And the point of vulnerability is to make one area less than the other. Speaking from an inexperienced perspective. And another way to put this is the best way to secure your environment is to make sure that everybody knows that it's their job to help secure your environment, right? Ranging from not knowing anything to being level 400, right? It's the culture that you build around security, understanding that it's the top priority and making sure that you have the policies and people understand, right? These are the things that you're trying to get to. And the knowledge quest, this is how you build aura, we like to say, right? Where you radiate that security knowledge. So if we're radiating, how do we do that? Well, we start out at L100. And in the case of today's episode, you'd be a zone scout. And what is a zone scout? Well, it's somebody who's just going out and trying to understand what the different pieces of the puzzle are. And a way to do so is kind of figuring out hey, what are policies and permissions in AWS and IAM and identity? How do I work with this? Well, if you go to the documentation, some of the key aspects that we were speaking about are called out here. What's an identity-based policy? What's a resource-based policy? What's a permission-based? And what is it? You can take that pause. Right? Because when you listen to somebody speak about it, sometimes you're like, what did you just say? And the beauty of doing this is you can stop and read and understand and dive deep. And I do this. I'm sure Russ does this. Is, hey, I don't understand the topic, so I'm going to go off on a wild tangent for about 3 hours just trying to figure out something. And then I'm going to report back and try and convert it into video game analogies. Right? So these are the things that we like to do and we love to do because, hey, it's fun. And when everybody gets on the same page and you're able to convert it in such a way that you can be, let's say, a productive security person within your environment, when you're not even a security person within your environment, I'm going to start writing, haikus and everything, Russ. That's going to be our next season. It's going to be a series of haikus.
We'll just have a whole episode.
Yeah.
Tristan's haikus.
Yeah. So going through that, right, is understanding all of the pieces of the puzzle. Yes. And I said haikus because I watched the anime so much that I just said it. Haikus. 10 billion points if you get that, right? The pearls of wisdom. But I digress. Global context keys, what are they? These are how you become a zone scout. What a zone scout is, you doing these things one piece at a time, understanding, okay, we spoke about principal org ID. What does it do when you're looking at that condition key? How do you handle it? When do you implement it? And this is where we go back to that concept of friend and foe within your environment. If you looked at our side quests, hey, authenticated users and unauthenticated users, they were right there. They were right together, right? It was like this margin thin, right? And usually the difference between somebody in and out of your environment is usually one line of code, right? Maybe two, right? One condition, maybe no condition. And that's where we're trying to get back to, right? Because once you understand that, you can start to be a loadout builder. And that loadout builder is saying, hey, I am able to automate these policies in such a way, manner, fashion, form, that I can do this in my sleep. I have automation. I have pipelines. I have, our agents able to do this, right? You see where a future episode is coming. But when you start to do it, spoilers, right? You start to understand the difference between a resource org and a source VPC, and then service control policies. That is some key aspects that you're getting to, right? And thank you, producer Jeff, for saying, hey, find all the episodes here. If you love this, if you love to hear our voices, or if you don't, you can turn off the voice and just look at us.
Look at the transcript. Yeah.
I suggest that. But when you start to go through and understand, you eventually become a circle closer. What is a circle closer? It's, hey, I know how to evaluate my resources in such a manner, fashion, and form that it reports, hey, what are these changes happening within my environment? Am I following any standards? Do I have a certain framework that I'm moving towards? So PCI or I would say other SOC 2, depending on your customized framework, but another episode. But as you're starting to get to all these
episodes.
Yeah, it's a series of episodes because this is all fun. And you might see our passion, our enthusiasm for this, because to be a circle closer means that you went through a number of different scenarios, right? And if you go through a number of different scenarios, what you learn is that you're taking the experience one piece at a time, help level up yourself and your environment and the knowledge. And then eventually becomes saying, hey, can we speak about different topics, right? Like, hey, may I ask this? How is security changed now that we're in the age of AI? Thank you for this question, TechBee. I would say it's changing the manner of people are now taking a step back to rethink, one, what is their data strategy? What is our overall security strategy? And three, what do we actually have within our environment? Right? If I take a 5-second tangent, thank you for this. What we start to see is, hey, tagging becomes extremely important. Why? Because where's your sensitive data? Where's your non-sensitive data? And where's your specific information that's unique to your company? Where does it lie? Is it all crammed into one? Or is it logically separated with different tagging mechanisms? Because if you're starting to consume or add in different agents that can read into and see, hey, this is some context that I want to take out to apply to my organization a certain way, maybe you need to have certain guardrails. And then you jump into that little area of, okay, how are they asking the questions? And if they ask it a certain way, do you have, pieces to protect against prompt injection, so on and so forth. But I digress, because the whole part of it is understanding your environment and then also understanding how AI and agent automation can help you take out some of, let's say, that work that you can, let's say, automate in such a way. If you have an incident responder agent, maybe you can pull together the different pieces of the puzzle of the resource, the tag, who it belongs to, the information, the context. So somebody, let's say a Russ, now they have all this information that they start off with, just jumping in. And now it reduces the mean time to respond and detect and all those things in between. So that's kind of how I see it, right? So, Russ, what is your thoughts on this piece?
Yeah, I agree with you. I think that's definitely bringing a lot of awareness back to those important documents, like your, target state security strategy. I don't know how you say that so often, so quickly, just like that. It gets me every time. And an incident response plan, stuff like that. It really is bringing a lot of looking back to that, but it's also taking the same principles that we've already done today and every other day with defense in depth and all of our loadout, and we apply it to our AI policies and guidelines, all of those things, right? But then, we also have a lot of capability with AI. And so it's like AI is bringing a lot more attention to overall strategy. It's bringing attention to how quickly and sometimes insecurely things could be built. It's also bringing into account potentially AI attacking, and it can do a lot of things on its own. Especially once we start talking about agent orchestration tools and being able to, pull all of this different data, then we can have like an entire, analyzing agent and a verification agent, and you really can do a lot of workflows agentically, and so it's changing a lot of things, I think, and it happens very quickly. And sometimes you need AI to keep up with AI changes.
Yeah, and the one piece, since we have like 20 seconds left, is just download and leverage Curo. The reason why I say that is you can build out a security spec relatively fast, right? That's a deep dive. And the other notion I would just want to share, because this is great, ABC, C, always be closing circles. Yes. The other thing I will leave off everybody with is this little thing is, be there or be square, that whole analogy. You know where it comes from, right, Russ? Because if you're not there, you won't be around. That's where it comes from. That little.
How do I exit out of this?
So until next week, come back for more fun facts like that as we speak about data perimeter and everything in between. Thank you all. And especially thank you, TechBee, for answering all the great questions. Velvet, thank you, as you laugh at our jokes as we sign off. Until next time, take care, have a full one, and be around, not a square.
I can't believe I fell for that.